Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. In the last lesson we considered the layout of an inheritance question, and we said that we draw a line which represents x, and underneath the line we place the surviving relatives, and I talked about how to decide which ones to put underneath here. So we might put the father, for example, the mother, and so on and so forth. In this lesson, I just want to talk about once we've got the categories of people here, we need to place a number here, and this number represents the lowest common denominator of the various fractions that each of these beneficiaries receive. So I mentioned previously that there are six fractions which any individual of the Zawil Furud will receive. That is a half, a quarter, an eighth, and 2/3, 1/3, and 1/6. And I mentioned that third halved divided by 2 is a sixth, and multiplied by 2 is 2/3, and similarly for a quarter and a half and an eighth. So let's say we have two fractions. We have one relative here and we have one relative here, and let's say one of them gets a quarter and another gets a quarter. What we need to do is we need to place a number here, which is again is the lowest common denominator. And those of you who remember your maths, you should remember that in a fraction you have the numerator at the top, and at the bottom you have the denominator. So what we want to do is we want to work out what is the lowest common denominator, and there's a classical way of doing this, and there may be a way you find easiest. So for example, in this situation, a quarter and a quarter, the lowest common denominator between 4 and 4 is obviously 4, because they both go into 4 and they go into it once. But it's not always going to be so straightforward. So classically the scholars have come up with 4 different scenarios, and in maths there's maybe various ways of looking at it, but I'm going to explain the way it's classically done, and if you want to use this method then fine. If you have your own way of doing it, that's fine. The end goal is to put the right number in this box here, and it doesn't really matter how you do it, but this is one way of doing it. So what classically we say is there are four different nisbahs between numbers. A nisbah is a connection or a link between numbers. So there are 4 different nisbahs between any two given numbers, between any numbers. So let's go through each of them in turn. So the first nisbah is called, in Arabic it's called damathul. Damathul. So the damathul. And what this means is similar. So it comes from the root word mathala, and it means same or similar. An example of this would be 4 and 4, 4 and 4, and as we learnt above, then the lowest common denominator is, it's very simple, it's just the same number. So lowest common denominator is equal to 4, and So both those numbers go into that. So if we ever have a situation where the numbers underneath the line, the, the denominators are both the same, then we would put that same number at the top. The second situation is called the تداخل. Write that again. تداخل. And this comes from the root word dakhala, and it means to enter. And what this means is one of the numbers enters into the other fully without leaving any remainder. So an example of that would be 2 and 4. 2 goes into 4 twice, and there's no remainder. And another example, 3 and 9. 3 goes into 9 3 times, and there's no remainder. So in this situation, the lowest common denominator is the higher number, is equal to 4. Lowest common denominator is equal to 9. And so above the line, we will put the higher number here, the 4 or the 9, for example. Next, so the third relationship is called توافق. And what this means is that you have two numbers, let's say 6 and 8, and 6 will go into 8, however there's a remainder, so there's a remainder of 2. However, although 6 goes into 8, there's a remainder of 2, there's a third number called the wathaq, which goes into both 6 and 8. And in this case, the wathaq is 2. So 2 goes into 6 3 times, and 2 goes into 8 4 times. Now, when we have a situation like this, we can work out the lowest common denominator. A simple method. What we do is let's take this. We have 6, and we have 8, and we have the wathaq 2. What we do is we know that 2 will go into 6 3 times. So we take this 3 and we multiply it by 8. So we multiply 3 by 8, which gives us our lowest common denominator, which is 24. And we can do it both ways. So we know that 2 goes into 8 4 times. So we take this wathaq, well, we take this number 4, and the wathaq is 2. We take this number 4 and we multiply it by 6. So it's 6 times 4, and again that's 24. And so either way, whichever way we do it, we find out the wathaq between the two numbers. We work out how many times that goes into one of the numbers, and we then multiply that amount by the other number. Sounds a bit complicated, and if you have an easier way of doing it, then fine. But essentially, this way works as well. So let's try it for another number which may make it clear. So we can do it for 8 and 12. 8 goes into 12, however there's a remainder of 4, and that's actually the wathaq. 4 will go in, so 4 is the wathaq. 4 goes into 8 twice. So we basically do 2 times 12, 2 times 12, and that gives 24 again. And similarly, if we were to do it the other way, 4 goes into 12 3 times, and if we do 3 times 8, we get 24. And that's our lowest common denominator, which we then place above the line here. We put 24 there. And then the final relationship is when we have two numbers. The relationship in Arabic is called tabayun. 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 And this is where we have two numbers, let's say 3 and 7. The smaller number goes into the bigger number, but there's always a remainder, and there's no third number which goes into both. So there's no third number which will go into both 3 and 7. And in this situation, all we do is times 3 by 7, and that gives 21, which is our lowest common denominator. So there's three relationships. So there's a total of 4 relationships. Go through them one by one. There's the Meerath, where the two numbers are the same, and the lowest common denominator is either of the numbers. There's the tadakhul, where there's two numbers, one goes into the other, and so the lowest common denominator is the higher number, and the one goes into the other, and there's no remainder. And the third is the wafuq, where the two numbers, one goes into the other, but there's a remainder. However, there's a third number, the wafuq, which goes into them both, and then we can work out the lowest common denominator from there. And then finally is the tabayun, where there's two numbers, one goes into the other, but there's a remainder. However, there's no third number which goes into both, whole number which goes into both of them, and so we work out the lowest common denominator simply by multiplying the two. So once we have our lowest common denominator, what do we do with it? Well, if we go back to our example up here, let's say, we can probably scroll across instead. Let's do an example where, let's do a simple example which will illustrate the point. So we have our line which represents the deceased. We have our beneficiaries, and let's use the zawja, the wife, and we can have the mother, and we can have a father, a son, let's say son. We know, we'll find out soon enough, that the zawja in this situation would receive an eighth, the mother would get a sixth, and the son would get asaba, the remainder. From our calculations previously, we know that 6 and 8 have a tawafuq relationship, which means that 6 goes into 8 but there's a remainder. However, there is a third number, namely 2, which goes into them both. Using the wafuq, we can then come to the lowest common denominator, which is 24. So we place 24 up here, and then the final stage of the calculation is to work out what an eighth of 24 is, and that comes to 3, and a sixth of 24 is 4, and then the remainder, after taking away 3 and 4, so we have 24, we take away 3, we take away 4, and we're left with 17, and we place 17 here, and then that now completes the calculation. The son receives 17 24ths, the mother receives 4 24ths, and the wife receives the remaining 3 24ths. So that's how we work it out, and key to that is the lowest common denominator, which we put in there. And one final point to mention is that it's called the lowest common denominator for a reason, We could have placed 48 in this box, so instead of 24 we could have put 48, and the calculation would still have worked out, but these numbers would have been doubled. And as you will find out later, when we have multiple beneficiaries, say we have 5 sons, 3 wives, then these numbers up here are going to become very big. There's going to be additional numbers here, and they're going to become very big, and the calculation is just going to become a lot more messy. So we always try to find the lowest common denominator in order to at the end we have, in order so that at the end we have the smallest numbers, and it's a lot easier to appreciate various values and divisions, etc. So that's how we set out a problem, and in the next few lessons we'll go through the various beneficiaries and their states.